I feel terrible for Deshaun Watson. I feel terrible for his fans. You've heard me talk about how the NFL is starting to figure out Josh Allen and how they're figuring out Lamar Jackson. Well, everything's on a spectrum with me, and figuring out is bad enough. Deshaun Watson, the NFL has solved him. That's bad. And unfortunately for the Houston Texans, I don't see a way for them to pull the genie back out of the bottle anytime soon. It is going to be a Herculean task to get this back to where it was. And in a way, we saw this from the start, but you're going from the best of times to the worst of times. And right now we're sitting in the worst of times. Now, when Watson came out, I had him rated far too low. I admit it, I had him far too low. And the reason I had him far too low is playing out in front of your eyes right now. The reason why I didn't give him enough credit is because I, at the time, valued hypermobility in quarterbacks very highly, but I still undervalued how much impact that would make on the game. And I liked his deep ball and creative capabilities. I just didn't expect them to come to the heights that they came to in the NFL. But when you land on a team with Hopkins and Fuller, that was definitely going to play out in his favor. But the negatives that we saw in Watson were that if you're a hypermobile quarterback and you're a threat to run, you're naturally going to push teams into a zone defense against you. They're going to want to keep extra bodies in front of you, keep extra eyes on the quarterback. And this was not what Watson wanted to see, because while he has an arm talent that has a ton of weight on it and allows him to drive beautiful timed placed pass down the field, his intermediate throws, the ball has an open tip to it. I actually called him flutter ball because of this. The velocity on the velocity gun showed this, and it shows up on film. So the velocity that was on his throw was low, yet he has a powerful arm. And this is because of the way that he was throwing the ball. And I knew that you take those two, like his best positives and his worst negative, and you mash it together, and it gives you the same answer. You want to play his zone to take away the positives. His weakest attributes show up against the zone. So I knew that with Watson, it would just be a matter of time before teams just said, zone him, we're good. And that's really what you saw on Sunday. Green Bay was down Savage and King, two of their best defensive backs. Green Bay does not have NFL level speed and range in their middle linebacker group. And yet Patton comes out, and I don't know if he stumbled into it because of the injuries or if he saw it and he just took it away. But he came out and he consistently played zone, and that was that. That was that. And when you have a team that is a high-pressure man defense, traditionally, that comes out and says, yeah, we'll play our secondary stuff. We'll play a lot of zone because that's what's best against you. And it works that well, then you know there's an absolute problem going on. And every team in the league knows this, and every team in the league's bringing it out to a higher percentage. And when a team that rarely ever plays it says we're going to be in it all day, then you're solved. You're solved. And the league knows exactly how to play you. And this ugliness is going to continue all year. There is no solution for the Houston Texans on this roster with this group to fix this problem. It's done for 2020. That's it. But then we look forward and we go, how can we take this back to where it was? What kind of decisions need to be made that can bring Watson back to his glory days? And the answer's there. It's just going to be very difficult to acquire. Now, first and foremost, it comes down to the head coach hiring. It has to be an offensive-minded head coach. Absolutely has to be. So I look at the offensive coordinators right now who are on the hot list of who's going to be the next head coach. And I don't want Watson in air raid because you zone that too easily and that takes too many things away. I don't want him in the McVay style offense because that is about quick reads and short area zip more than anything else. So these don't fit him. So Arthur Smith, not a good fit. Anything from the college ranks, you can pretty much rule off as not a really good fit. So it really comes down to two guys, in my opinion, because of what they've shown they can do and what their offense has in it. And the first one is Eric Bieniemy in Kansas City. There's enough horizontal stretch that if you pair that with Watson's mobility, could cause a lot of problems that would be able to at least push a zone's limits a little bit. Something that could help them beat teams like New England, where if they can stretch them a little more horizontally, they can break down their gap integrity. On top of that, they have a ton of deep work in that scheme, and that would benefit him greatly to have an offense that is attacking down the field, because again, that is his best trait by far. The other coordinator that I'm looking at for the Houston Texans job is up in Buffalo, Brian Daboll. Now, Brian Daboll is working wonders with Josh Allen, in my opinion. And Josh Allen and Deshaun Watson, very, very different quarterbacks. So Daboll will have to mold his offense to Watson. But he's shown he can mold an offense to Allen. And I believe he'll be able to mold his offense to Watson as well. There are a number of things that Daboll is doing in that offense that would transition one for one. But there would have to also be a great number of changes. But I think he's smart enough. Flatly. I think he's smart enough to figure out what would be best for his quarterback. And I've said it a number of times, what's an offensive coordinator who's smart enough and humble enough to cater to his quarterback? A head coach. And I feel that's where Brian Daboll's headed right now. So I think that would be a great hire for Houston as well, and would be a good way to get Watson back to where he was. But the most important part about this, even though the head coach is very important, personnel has to change in Houston. Vastly. The first thing that needs to be done is David Johnson needs to be gone. There's zero reason for him. You do not have the ability to pay him if you're going to accomplish the other pieces of this offense that you need. You don't pay running backs. You don't pay running backs with a quarterback like Watson. There are so many things that he can do with veer mesh, read options, and RPOs that can open up a gap for running back that you don't need somebody who's going to create for himself. You see it with the Rams. I'll talk about that in a different video. But when you have a quarterback who can stretch a defense horizontally, the running back value decreases. And I really think Duke Johnson would have a chance to be a pretty darn good back if you gave him a little bit more on his plate. Plus, you could find one later in the draft just as well. The second thing the Texans need to do, and it sounds counterintuitive, but they immediately have to stop investing in the offensive line. At this point in time, they have already overinvested in cap and overinvested in draft capital on the offensive line. And this is because of Watson. When you have a quarterback who has the mobility of Watson, the last thing you want to do is put a ton of assets into the offensive line, because Watson himself can salvage a bad offensive line with his mobility. You see defensive ends wanting to contain instead of rush because they're afraid of him getting out the side of the pocket. You see teams in a lot more contain. And his ability to scramble obviously is able to keep him on his feet and keep plays going and create as the play goes on. So you do not want to put a ton of assets into the offensive line. Look at Seattle, for example. Yes, they have their left tackle. You have Tunsil. But the rest of the offensive line has kind of been, patchwork together, and that's because Wilson creates. Wilson can scare a defensive line into not being able to generate a pass rush. Wilson can get away from a pass rush, step up, move in the pocket, and salvage the liabilities of an offensive line. And the wide receiver group needs to change dramatically. Fuller is a keeper. That is the one that you want to keep. Cooks needs to move into the slot, because every single wide receiver that you put on the field must be considered a deep threat. That is to push teams to a 3-high coverage look. You do not have the talent on the field with Cobb out there to scare teams into a 3-high. And that is inexcusable and impossible for Watson, because that crashes the windows on the intermediate zone. And that's what he's struggling with most at this point in time. I like Randall Cobb. He's a terrible fit with Watson. Cooks in the slot, and you're looking to replace him with a younger kid who has vertical deep speed. But most importantly is you need another boundary one threat. You just traded Hopkins. You need to find someone who is at least in the ballpark of Hopkins outside. Because if you don't have the three verts, the whole thing becomes very, very difficult. With the way that the spacing of the defense is able to shrink windows on Watson and challenge his arm in the intermediate. So the Texans need to get Dabble or Bieniemy. They need to release David Johnson, work their way away from having Brandon Cooks. Kenny Stills will be gone, and Randall Cobb should be moved on from as well. That's a substantial amount of cap. That's roughly, I think, $35 million of cap that they could save. And we have seen good wide receivers come out in the second and third round in the last couple years. A player like Duvernay would help. Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf, A.J. Brown were in the second round last year. Even an Andy Isabella would be a positive for them to just continue to build that depth. But what you need to know with Watson is that you must have vertical speed and you must have a full stable full of wide receivers, because Fuller's one, but the rest of it isn't there. And if you don't have three, he's going to struggle. Obviously, the defense has their own issues, but when you have a franchise quarterback like Watson, and he absolutely is one, every decision you have to make from this point forward has to be generated around how do we get him right, because he is the only chance that Houston has to win at this point in time. So the head coach hire has to be dictated by the talents of Watson. The draft, and especially a glut of wide receivers who have vertical speed, has to be dictated by the talents of Watson. If you can do that in the draft, and if you can put those right pieces around him, that's going to save you an exorbitant amount of money. And that is going to be money that you're able to move over to the defensive side of the ball. It's not incredibly difficult to pull off, but if you want to get it back to where it was, it's going to take some players, and it's going to take some draft picks that hit quite substantially. Earlier in the season, Bob decided to, tell the reporters that they could only trade Hopkins to teams with rookie quarterbacks because nobody else could afford him on his cap number. And what Bob didn't realize is Houston couldn't afford to lose him. They had to skimp anywhere else that they possibly could to afford to keep Hopkins. And that's what Houston needs to understand as they move forward. You need to take care of your wide receivers. You need to take care of your quarterback. Everything else is secondary. The talents of Watson help your offensive line. The talents of Watson need vertical wide receivers and wide receivers that are able to space the defense. Those three things have to be in line, or this will not work. And that's the thing, that's the part of this that Bob took apart in his GM tinkering that cost him his job, cost him the locker room, cost this Houston Texans this season, and awarded Miami with a draft pick that is just going to be phenomenal. So unfortunately for now, the conversation on Watson, in our opinion, is dead. This is where it is, and this isn't going to change until something forces it to change. That's what we're going to be watching with Watson from this time forward. Are the pieces coming back in place that can allow him to elevate his game back up to the high level that he was playing in the past? This is something you're going to want to pay attention to, because people are going to start to fade on Watson as these stats continue to decline as the season goes on. But we know that there's a solution. We know that he has been solved by the league right now, but we know there's a way to break that solution back in his favor. And we have to see the moves taking place that are going to allow that to happen. But once we start to see those moves, that's a buy low. That's when you start believing in Watson again. But for now, we're just in a holding pattern. We're waiting. We're watching. Houston, it's on you. Don't screw it up. I love you guys. We need you. Stay strong, and I'll see you on the other side.